People think South Park just gets away with everything. No topic too dark, no target too big, nothing ever really touches it. Trey Parker and Matt Stone built a reputation on being untouchable. A dead activist, a foreign government, and a sitting president would all disagree. In this video, we look at all the times South Park nearly got canceled. The first cut. South Park had only been on the air for a few weeks when the network reached into one of its own episodes and physically removed something the creators had already filmed and aired. This happened during the very first season on the 5th episode ever made. Long before religion, world leaders, or angry governments ever became part of the story. The reason had nothing to do with outrage from a church or a foreign country. It came from a real house fire, a real child, and a fear that a cartoon could push a kid toward doing something deadly. South Park began airing on Comedy Central in August of 1997. The network was small at the time, nowhere near the size it would grow into over the following decades. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were young filmmakers from Colorado who had built an early, rougher version of the show using construction paper cutouts years before Comedy Central picked it up. Once the show got picked up, the two of them worked at a breakneck pace, often finishing episodes just days before they aired. The town itself, South Park, Colorado, was loosely based on the real area where Parker grew up, and many of the characters carried pieces of his actual life, whether he intended that or not. The show became a hit almost overnight. Word spread fast about a cartoon that let its child characters curse, get hurt, and say things no other animated series would touch. Comedy Central knew they had something big, and they also knew they had something risky. Every episode had to pass through a team inside the network whose entire job was to flag anything that might cause real trouble once it hit television screens across the country. This team looked at violence, language, and any content that might upset advertisers or spark public backlash. In the earliest days of the show, before anyone truly understood how far Parker and Stone were willing to push things, that internal review process was still figuring out where the line actually was. The episode at the center of this story is called An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig. It aired on September 10th, 1997, making it the 5th episode of the show's very first season. On the surface, the plot sounds almost gentle compared to what South Park would become known for later. In class, the boys' teacher, Mr. Garrison, gives a lesson on genetic engineering. This gets Kyle thinking about combining animal traits, and he decides he wants to create a pot-bellied elephant by mixing elephant and pig genetics. A classmate named Terrence Mephisto overhears the idea and challenges Kyle to a bet, claiming he can clone an entire human being before Kyle manages to breed his new animal. To chase this idea further, the boys travel outside town to a genetic engineering ranch run by Terrence's father, Dr. Alphonse Mephisto. Mephisto shows them a collection of strange creatures he has already created through his experiments. Animals with extra limbs and mismatched body parts, treating the whole thing like a normal afternoon at work. When the boys try to figure out how to get an elephant and a pig to actually mate, Chef offers a simple solution, suggesting they get both animals drunk so nature can take its course. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Dr. Mephisto secretly creates a giant deformed clone using a sample of Stan's blood. It turns out Terrence is Mephisto's own son, adding a strange family angle to the science experiment gone wrong. The clone escapes and begins tearing through the town, smashing through buildings and terrifying the people of South Park. Stan eventually catches up to his own giant twin and manages to calm it down. Rather than see it as a threat, Stan sees an opportunity. He wants the clone to go after his older sister Shelly, who has spent the entire episode beating him up without mercy. This is where the episode's real emotional weight sits, not in the science fiction plot, but in the constant casual violence between a bully of an older sister and her younger brother who has no way to fight back. Throughout the episode, Shelly is shown throwing Stan down a flight of stairs, dropping a television directly onto his head, tossing him out a window, running him over with a lawnmower, and generally treating him like a punching bag whenever their parents are not watching. None of this is presented as shocking within the show itself. It plays as dark comedy, the kind of exaggerated sibling cruelty the show would return to again and again over the years. What makes this particular episode different is one specific moment that Comedy Central decided could not stay on the air once people started watching it closely. In the original cut of the episode, Shelly does not stop at throwing her brother around physically. At one point, she pours a liquid over Stan and sets him on fire. After putting the flames out, she repeats the entire action a second time, dousing him again and lighting him up once more. It is played the same way as everything else in the episode, fast, cartoonish, and absurd. The kind of scene meant to get a laugh rather than provoke fear. Stan, in typical South Park fashion, barely reacts to any of it beyond mild annoyance, telling his sister that one day he will be bigger and stronger than her, and she will regret everything she has done to him. This scene aired exactly as written when the episode debuted in September of 19 1997. It was not until sometime after that first broadcast that Comedy Central made the decision to cut it. The network's concern traced back to a real and tragic event that had happened a few years earlier, one that had nothing to do with South Park, but everything to do with how cartoons involving fire could be blamed for real-world harm. In 1993, a 5-year-old boy in Ohio set fire to the mobile home he lived in. The fire killed his 2-year-old sister. In the aftermath, the boy's mother told reporters that her son had been influenced by the MTV cartoon Beavis and Butthead, a show that regularly featured its 2 teenage characters saying the word fire in an exaggerated, almost celebratory way whenever something burned. The claim spread quickly through news coverage at the time, and even though later reporting raised serious doubts about how directly the show actually influenced the boy's actions, the damage to the show's reputation was already done. MTV responded by pulling references to fire from reruns, editing out scenes where the characters played with matches or lighters, and moving the show to a later time slot where fewer children would be watching. That controversy stuck around in the memory of television executives for years afterward, especially anyone working at a network that produced animated shows aimed at older audiences, but still watched by plenty of younger viewers who probably should not have been tuning in. When South Park arrived with its own scene of a child setting another child on fire, even in a wildly cartoonish and clearly fictional way, it triggered the same worry all over again. Comedy Central did not want to be the next network blamed for a copycat tragedy, so the fire scene involving Shelley and Stan was quietly removed from all future airings of the episode. The way the scene was cut left behind a strange and lasting mistake. In the edited version that has aired in reruns and appeared on home releases ever since, there's a moment where Stan is shown sitting in a puddle of liquid on the ground, delivering his line about someday growing bigger than his sister, with absolutely no explanation for why he is sitting in a puddle at all. The liquid was originally meant to be part of Shelley dousing him before setting him on fire again, but once that entire action was removed, the puddle stayed behind purely by accident, a leftover piece of a scene that no longer technically existed. For years, this odd detail sat there unexplained to anyone watching who had not seen the original uncut version. Even Parker and Stone themselves have said in later commentary that they could not immediately remember why the puddle was there when they rewatched the episode, since so much time had passed since the edit was first made. The uncut version of the scene has never been restored on any official release since that original 1997 broadcast. It never appeared on VHS, never made it onto DVD collections, and never returned when the show eventually moved to newer streaming services. The only reason anyone today knows exactly what the original scene looked like is because someone recorded the episode off their television during that first broadcast, long before people had any easy way to save digital copies of shows. That old recording has been the only surviving record of the unedited scene ever since, passed around among fans over the years as a piece of television history that Comedy Central never intended to preserve. When the show eventually received a high-definition remaster years later, the version that plays on modern streaming platforms took a different approach to the mistake. Rather than restoring the original fire scene, the remastered version simply removed the puddle entirely, cleaning up the visual error without bringing back the content that caused it in the first place. Watching that version today, there is no confusing leftover detail at all. Stan simply sits on the ground and delivers his line, with no explanation needed because the visual clue that once hinted at the missing scene has been erased along with it. Beyond the Shelley subplot, the episode holds a few other details worth knowing. The genetic engineering storyline ends with Dr. Mephisto's giant Stan clone accidentally killing Kenny by throwing him into a microwave, cooking him to death in front of the town. Kenny dying in ridiculous ways became one of the show's most famous recurring jokes over the years. But this particular version of his death has been singled out by Parker and Stone themselves as one they were not fully happy with, feeling it came across as a cheap way to kill the character rather than something that fit naturally into the story. The episode also features a musical cameo from the singer Elton John, who provided guest vocals for a song performed by the character Chef. This made it one of the earliest examples of the show bringing in a real celebrity voice for a bit, a practice that would become a regular part of South Park's identity in years to come. There is also a small piece of behind-the-scenes trivia about the episode's original title. Before the network got involved, Parker and Stone reportedly wanted to call the episode something far cruder than the version that ultimately aired. Comedy Central pushed back on that title choice, and the softer version, An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig, is the one that made it to air. It stands as an early, mild example of the same kind of push and pull between the show's creators and the network that would define much of South Park's history going forward. Though in this specific case, the disagreement was resolved quietly and never became a public story story the way later fights over content would. The Shelley storyline itself was not invented purely for comedy. Trey Parker has spoken about the fact that he actually has an older sister named Shelley in real life, and that she used to physically bully him when they were growing up, including throwing him down a flight of stairs at least once. The version of Shelley in the episode, and the character who would continue appearing throughout the show for years afterward, grew directly out of those real memories, exaggerated for television but rooted in something true about Parker's own childhood. Even the fantasy of using a giant clone to finally get revenge on an older sibling reportedly came from a similar daydream Parker had as a kid, wishing he had some larger version of himself around to even the score. What makes this episode stand apart from almost every other instance of South Park running into trouble over the years is the reason behind the cut itself. Nearly every other time the show would face censorship, bans, or outright threats in the decades that followed, the cause traced back to an outside group taking offense, whether that meant a religious organization, a foreign government, or a political figure and their supporters. This episode is different. Nobody protested it. No organized group demanded it be pulled. There was no petition, no news cycle built around outrage, and no threat of violence aimed at the creators. The decision came entirely from within the network itself, driven by a quiet fear of repeating history rather than any pressure from the outside world. It was less about controversy and more about caution, a network trying to avoid becoming part of a tragic story a second time. This distinction matters because it shows that South Park's long relationship with censorship did not begin with the show provoking anger from a specific community or power. It began with a much simpler and sadder concern: the idea that a cartoon showing a child being set on fire, even in an obviously exaggerated and joke-driven way, might somehow inspire a real child to try the same thing. Comedy Central was not trying to protect its own reputation from an outside campaign. It was trying to prevent the kind of accident that had already happened once before, tied to a completely different show, years earlier. Looking back at this moment now, decades after it happened, it stands as a small but telling first entry in a much longer pattern. A young, rapidly rising show, barely 5 episodes into its existence, already testing the limits of what a network was willing to broadcast, and already running into a wall, even if that wall came from an unexpected direction. The show would go on to face far louder, far more dangerous conflicts in the years ahead. Situations involving death threats, international bans, and government pushback on a scale nobody watching this early episode could have predicted. But this first cut, quiet and largely unnoticed at the time outside of the fans who happened to catch that original broadcast, marked the very beginning of a much bigger story about a cartoon that would spend the rest of its existence testing exactly how far it could go before something, somewhere, decided to pull the plug. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That first act of caution from the network turned out to be nothing compared to what was coming. Within just a few years, the show would put a real religious figure on screen without a second thought, and for a while, nobody seemed to mind at all. It would take much longer, and a very different kind of controversy entirely, before that same choice came back around to cause trouble all over again. Section 2. The joke that aged into a threat. Long before the phrase South Park and Muhammad ever appeared together in a single news headline, the show had already put the religious figure on screen. It happened quietly, without protest, without a single angry letter to the network, and without anyone treating it as a big deal at the time. The episode is called Super Best Friends, and it aired on July 4th, 2001, as the 3rd episode of the show's 5th season. For years, this episode existed as nothing more than a strange, silly team-up story about religious figures fighting an evil magician. It took almost a decade for that same episode to become one of the most talked about and hardest to find pieces of the entire series. Not because of anything that changed inside the episode itself, but because of events that happened years later in the real world. To understand why this episode later became such a problem, it helps to look at exactly what happens inside it. The plot centers on the real-life magician and illusionist David Blaine, who is famous around that time for public stunts like standing frozen in a block of ice or staying buried underground for days at a time. In the episode, Blaine is not just performing magic tricks for entertainment. He starts using his abilities to build a following of people who believe he possesses actual supernatural powers. This following grows into something much bigger than simple fandom. It turns into a full-blown cult, with Blaine positioned as a kind of god-like leader over his followers. The show even gives this fictional group a name, calling it Blaintology, a clear play on the real-world term Scientology, even though the episode itself never directly mentions Scientology by name. As Blaine's cult grows more powerful and more dangerous, the town of South Park needs help dealing with the threat. This is where the episode introduces its central idea, a superhero team made up of major major religious figures from different faiths around the world. The team includes Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, Buddha, Joseph Smith, Krishna, and Lao Tzu, each one given a specific superhero-style power based loosely on ideas connected to their religious traditions. Jesus, for example, is shown as the leader of the group, coordinating the others and stepping in during key moments. Muhammad is given a power the show calls Muhammad Power, which lets him shoot fire directly from his fists. The other figures each get their own unique ability as well, all presented in a fast, cartoonish action movie style that treats the whole thing more like a silly parody of superhero teams than any kind of serious statement about religion itself. The episode plays out mostly as an adventure story built around this team of heroes working together to stop David Blaine and free his followers from the cult he has built. It moves quickly, jumps between action scenes, and wraps up in typical South Park fashion, resolving the conflict in a way that pokes fun at both organized cult behavior and the kind of over-the-top team-up stories common in comic books and action movies. At no point does the episode set out to insult any specific religion or present its lineup of religious figures as anything other than equal members of the same team, each treated with the same lighthearted, exaggerated tone. What stands out the most today, looking back at how the episode was received when it first aired, is just how little reaction it got. There were no protests outside Comedy Central's offices, no foreign governments issued statements, no religious organizations organized letter-writing campaigns demanding an apology. The episode aired, people watched it, and life continued as normal. Muhammad appeared on screen, spoke lines, used a superhero power, and interacted with the other characters just like anyone else in the cast. And none of it caused so much as a ripple of public controversy at the time. This matters because it shows something important about how quickly the world around South Park changed in the years that followed. The show was not always treated as dangerous or provocative simply for putting Muhammad's image on screen. For a long stretch of time, doing exactly that carried no special weight at all. It was just another character choice in just another episode, no different in the eyes of most viewers from any of the other religious figures who showed up alongside him. The shift did not come from South Park itself doing anything differently. It came from a series of real-world events that unfolded thousands of miles away, tied to a completely different piece of media. In September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a set of 12 cartoons depicting Muhammad, created by different artists and meant to spark discussion about self-censorship and the boundaries of free expression within journalism. The reaction to these cartoons grew far beyond anything the newspaper likely expected. Protests broke out in multiple countries, some of them turning violent, with reports of over 100 deaths connected to demonstrations and unrest linked to the controversy. Danish embassies faced attacks in some locations, and the story became one of the biggest international news events of that period, touching on questions of religious respect, free speech, and the responsibility of media outlets when covering sensitive topics. This event fundamentally changed how depicting Muhammad visually was treated across almost all forms of Western media going forward. What had once been an uncommon but largely uneventful choice, the kind of thing Super Best Friends had done years earlier without any backlash, now carried real and serious risk. Newspapers, television networks, and other outlets became far more cautious about showing any image of Muhammad at all, worried about triggering the kind of violent reaction the Danish cartoons had set off. South Park itself became directly tangled up in this shift just 1 year after the Danish cartoon controversy exploded. In April of 2006, the show aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, built entirely around the debate over whether a cartoon should be allowed to show an image of Muhammad, using the rival animated show Family Guy as the fictional target of that debate within the story. That episode arc will be covered in full detail on its own, since it deserves its own complete telling, but it is worth noting here because of how directly it connects back to Super Best Friends. Once Cartoon Wars aired and the show found itself at the center of a much bigger, much more serious version of the same argument, older episodes containing similar content suddenly looked very different than they once had. Super Best Friends had been sitting quietly in the show's back catalog for 5 years by that point, mostly forgotten outside of longtime fans, but its subject matter now placed it directly inside a conversation the entire world was suddenly paying close attention to. Things escalated again a few years later, in 2010, when South Park aired its 2-part 200th episode celebration, made up of the episodes titled 200 and 201. These episodes will also get their own full sections later, since the events surrounding them involve real threats made against the show's creators and represent one of the most serious moments in the show's entire history. For the purposes of understanding what happened to Super Best Friends specifically, the key detail is simple. The controversy surrounding 200 and 201 became so intense, and the concerns about safety became so so real that Comedy Central made the decision to pull both of those episodes from any future broadcast or streaming release entirely. Once that decision was made, the network did not stop there. Looking back across the show's history at any episode containing a visual depiction of Muhammad, network executives decided the safest path forward was to remove all of them from circulation, regardless of how old the episode was or how little attention it had originally received. This is exactly how Super Best Friends ended up swept into the same fate as 200 and 201, despite having aired nearly a decade earlier under completely different circumstances, with zero controversy attached to it at the time. The episode itself never changed. Nothing about its content became more offensive with age. What changed was the surrounding world and the network's willingness to take any risk associated with the subject matter, even a risk tied to a mostly forgotten episode that had never caused a single problem during its original run. Today, tracking down an uncensored, complete version of Super Best Friends through official channels is extremely difficult. It does not appear on Paramount Plus, the streaming service that now hosts the vast majority of South Park's massive episode library. It has been left out of home video collections that otherwise include full seasons from that era of the show. For casual fans who grew up watching the series through official streaming platforms, this particular episode essentially does not exist within their experience of the show at all, hidden away because of a rule that only started applying to it years after it first aired. This creates an interesting and somewhat unusual situation within the larger story of South Park's history with censorship. Most episodes that faced bans or heavy edits ran into trouble either immediately upon release or shortly after, tied directly to reactions from audiences, governments, or organized groups responding to that specific piece of content. Super Best Friends followed a completely different path. It lived an entire quiet decade as an ordinary, mostly unremarkable episode before suddenly becoming radioactive. Not because of anything new inside the episode, but because the entire surrounding conversation about depicting Muhammad had shifted so dramatically underneath it. There is also something worth noting about how the episode itself has aged, separate from the censorship question entirely. Watching it now, decades removed from its original airing, the tone comes across as far less pointed or aggressive than people might expect given its later reputation. It plays much closer to a lighthearted parody of superhero team-ups than anything resembling a targeted statement about any single religion. Muhammad is treated the same way every other figure on the team is treated, given a silly power, a role within the group, and a place in an adventure story built more around mocking cult behavior and comic book tropes than making any serious point about faith itself. The show would eventually create content that was far more pointed and intentional in tackling questions of religious depiction and free speech directly. But Super Best Friends was not originally built to be that kind of statement. It became one almost by accident, pulled into a much larger and more serious debate simply by existing at the wrong moment in television history. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken over the years about their general approach to including religious figures in the show, often describing their goal as treating every religion equally rather than singling any one of them out for harsher treatment than the others. Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Mormonism, and many other faiths have all appeared as subjects of jokes and storylines across the show's long run, sometimes in ways just as exaggerated or silly as anything shown in Super Best Friends. The idea behind including Muhammad in this same lineup was, by the creator's own stated logic, an extension of that same equal treatment approach rather than an attempt to provoke anger specifically tied to Islam. The reality that later events made this particular choice far more dangerous and complicated than any of the other religious jokes scattered throughout the show says less about the intent behind Super Best Friends and more about how quickly and severely the real-world situation around this one specific subject changed. Fans who have managed to track down the unedited version of the episode through unofficial means online, since the official version remains locked out of easy public access, generally describe the same reaction. The episode reads today as a strange time capsule, a piece of media created just before the world around its subject matter changed permanently. Watching it now carries a different kind of weight than it would have carried back in 2001, not because the jokes themselves changed, but because everyone watching now understands the years of real-world violence, threats, and international tension that followed shortly after its release, none of which existed yet at the moment the episode first aired. The story of Super Best Friends stands as an important piece of the larger picture, precisely because it shows how the show's relationship with censorship was never something fixed in place from the very beginning. It shifted constantly based on outside events entirely disconnected from anything South Park itself controlled. An episode could air peacefully one year and become one of the most restricted pieces pieces of content in the entire series a decade later, all without a single frame of animation ever being altered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This sets up one of the most important turning points in the show's entire history, the moment when South Park stopped simply including Muhammad as one character among many, and instead built an entire episode arc directly confronting the question of whether he could be shown on television at all. That decision would pull the show into open conflict with its own network, force a real fight over what could and could not air, and mark the beginning of a much louder, much more public phase of South Park's long relationship with controversy. Section 3. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2. By the time South Park reached its 10th season, the show had already survived nearly a decade of network pushback, changing content rules, and a handful of quiet edits made behind the scenes. Nothing up to that point, though, had ever turned the fight over censorship into the actual subject of an episode. That changed in April of 2006, when South Park aired a two-part story that did something no episode before it had attempted. Instead of simply running into trouble with the network after the fact, the show built an entire episode arc directly around the question of whether a cartoon should be allowed to show an image of Muhammad, using a rival animated show as the target of that argument within the story itself. The two episodes are called Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2. They are the third and fourth episodes of the show's 10th season, and together, they make up the 142nd and 143rd episodes of the series overall. Part 1 aired on April 5th, 2006, with Part 2 following exactly 1 week later on April 12th, 2006. Both episodes were written and directed by Trey Parker, continuing the pattern of the two creators handling nearly every part of the show's production themselves, from scripts to voice work to editing. The story begins with the town of South Park thrown into full-blown panic. Word spreads that a television program is planning to broadcast an image of Muhammad that same night, and the entire community reacts as if the end of the world is coming. Randy Marsh announces to the town that the cartoon responsible is Family Guy, a Fox animated sitcom that had built its reputation around fast, unconnected joke sequences called cutaway gags, where the show interrupts its main story to show a quick, often random comedic scene before returning to the plot. Terrified residents lock themselves inside the town's community center, boarding up windows and stockpiling supplies as though bracing for an attack, convinced that airing the image will provoke violence from extremists somewhere in the world. While the adults spiral into full panic mode, the show's two central kids find themselves on opposite sides of a much smaller, more personal argument. Cartman despises Family Guy, and not for any reason connected to religion or safety. He simply thinks the show is lazy, built entirely around random jokes that have no connection to each other or to any real story, and he sees the Muhammad controversy as the perfect excuse to get the show canceled entirely. Kyle, on the other hand, genuinely enjoys watching Family Guy and pushes back against Cartman's plan, insisting that pulling one specific episode over safety concerns is very different from wanting to destroy an entire show simply because someone does not personally enjoy it. By the next morning, the town discovers that Fox network executives made the decision to censor the Muhammad image at the last possible moment before the episode aired, covering the character with a black box rather than showing him on screen. The immediate threat passes and the town breathes a collective sigh of relief, but the story is far from over. Cartman and Kyle, along with Stan and Kenny, decide to head to Kyle's house to watch the already aired episode using a recorded copy, only to be caught by Kyle's parents partway through. Kyle's father, furious that his son would even want to watch something connected to the controversy, smashes the television with a baseball bat, while Kyle's mother lectures the boys about respecting religious sensitivity, adding another layer to the episode's larger point about how different people in the same town react to the exact same situation in wildly different ways. The story escalates further when word gets out that Family Guy plans to air a second episode, this time attempting to show the Muhammad image completely uncensored. A fictional terrorist figure within the show, modeled after a real-world extremist leader, issues a warning promising a massive response if the image airs. This pushes the conflict from a debate about taste and comedy into something the show frames as a genuine question about safety, mixing real-world fear with the absurdity of a small mountain town treating a cartoon broadcast like a matter of life and death. Cartman, seeing an opportunity to finally get what he wants, travels to Hollywood to meet directly with the president of Fox, hoping to convince him to cancel Family Guy entirely, rather than simply pull the one controversial episode. During this meeting, the episode reveals its own joke about how Family Guy gets written in in the first place, showing a room full of manatees, sea creatures with no clear reasoning behind their choices, dropping random words into a machine that spits out finished jokes with no connection to story or character. This scene works as South Park's own pointed criticism of what Parker and Stone saw as lazy writing on a rival show, delivered through the same kind of absurd, over-the-top visual gag the show was known for using to make its points. Kyle refuses to give up on defending Family Guy's right to exist, and eventually travels to Hollywood himself to make his case directly to the same Fox executive Cartman had been trying to convince. In doing so, Kyle delivers a speech about the importance of allowing controversial content to air, arguing that giving in to fear and censorship over one thing eventually leads to giving in over everything, and that networks bending to intimidation sets a dangerous example regardless of what the specific content happens to be. This argument sits at the emotional center of the entire two-part story, carried by a child character delivering a message that closely mirrors what the show's actual creators believed about their own situation. The episode's climax comes down to whether Fox will actually allow the second Family Guy episode to air showing Muhammad without any censorship at all. In the end, the network backs down, choosing instead to censor the moment yet again. Rather than showing Muhammad, the aired scene simply shows the character handing another character a helmet shaped oddly like a piece of sports equipment, with the joke reduced to almost nothing because of how much had been edited out. In response, an animated version of a real extremist figure follows through on the earlier threat, releasing a short, deliberately offensive cartoon in retaliation, showing cardboard cutout versions of real public figures behaving in a disgusting and disrespectful manner toward each other, and an American flag. The episode uses this jarring contrast to ask a direct question about double standards, framing the retaliation cartoon as something clearly allowed to air without any pushback at all, while a simple, non-offensive image of Muhammad standing normally had been treated as far too dangerous to show under any circumstances. This entire storyline traced directly back to a real controversy that had exploded across the world just months before the episode aired. In September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a set of cartoons depicting Muhammad, created as part of a larger conversation about self-censorship within journalism. The reaction spiraled into a massive international story, sparking protests across dozens of countries, some of which turned violent, along with attacks on diplomatic buildings connected to Denmark, and a wave of debate about the boundaries of free expression when it came to religious imagery. By the time South Park sat down to build its 10th season, this controversy had become one of the defining media stories of the previous year, and Parker and Stone chose to build an entire episode arc directly engaging with it, rather than avoiding the subject. Behind the scenes, the making of Cartoon Wars involved real friction between the show's creators and their own network. According to reporting on the production of the episode, Parker and Stone ran into resistance from both Comedy Central and its parent company at the time, Viacom, who expressed concern that insisting on showing the Muhammad image disregarded genuine worries about safety for everyone involved in making and broadcasting the show. Rather than simply losing that fight quietly behind closed doors the way the network conflict over the fire scene years earlier had played out, Parker and Stone made a decision that turned the entire disagreement into part of the story itself. The struggle between the show's creators and the network became the plot of Part 2, blurring the line between the fictional conflict happening to the characters and the very real conflict happening behind the scenes during production. When Part 2 finally aired, Comedy Central made its own decision clear in the most direct way possible. At the exact moment the story built towards showing Muhammad, the network replaced the moment with a plain black screen carrying a short written statement explaining that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast the image. This was not a joke written into the show by Parker and Stone. It was the network's own message, inserted directly into the broadcast, openly telling the audience that a decision had been made above the heads of the people who created the episode. The following day, on April 13th, 2006, Comedy Central issued an official statement addressing the decision publicly, saying that in light of recent world events, the network felt it had made the right choice. The reaction to this moment split sharply along different lines. Many viewers and commentators saw the network's censorship as exactly the kind of hypocrisy the episode itself had been built to criticize, pointing out the irony of a network stepping in to block an image, while the episode using that exact situation as its central joke aired anyway. Conservative commentators who had previously shown little interest in South Park found themselves praising the show for taking on the subject directly, while others defended Comedy Central's caution as a reasonable response to a genuinely increasingly dangerous set of real-world circumstances following the Danish cartoon violence. The debate stretched across news coverage, opinion columns, and online discussion for weeks after the episodes aired, cementing Cartoon Wars as one of the most talked about pieces of television that entire year. What makes Cartoon Wars different from almost everything that came before it in South Park's history with censorship is the level of intention behind the conflict. The fire scene, cut from an early season 1 episode, had come from a quiet, internal decision made without any public fight attached to it. The later disappearance of Super Best Friends happened almost by accident, swept up years later into rules created because of separate events entirely disconnected from anything in that original episode. Cartoon Wars was different because Parker and Stone walked directly into the fight on purpose, fully aware of the real-world tension surrounding the subject, and built a story specifically designed to force the exact kind of confrontation that eventually happened. Rather than being surprised by network interference, they seemed to be expecting it, and used that expectation as fuel for the episode itself. There is also a layer to Cartoon Wars that goes beyond the Muhammad controversy entirely, tied to Parker and Stone's actual opinions about Family Guy as a show. Public comments made by the two creators over the years reveal a genuine dislike for what they saw as Family Guy's reliance on disconnected joke sequences rather than storytelling built around character and plot. The manatee scene inside Cartoon Wars, showing random word generation standing in for the entire creative process behind the rival show, reflects that real opinion directly, wrapped inside the larger story about censorship rather than existing as its own separate joke. This gives the two-part episode a strange double purpose, functioning simultaneously as a serious statement about free speech and religious depiction, and as a much more personal jab at a competing show the creators genuinely did not respect. The ending of Part 2 closes on Kyle's unresolved frustration, having failed to convince the network to allow the uncensored image to air despite his impassioned argument. The episode does not offer a neat, satisfying resolution where free speech triumphs and everyone learns a lesson. Instead, it ends on the same note of hypocrisy and double standard it spent the entire runtime building toward, leaving the actual outcome of the argument unresolved in a way that mirrored the real, ongoing debate happening across the country at the time. Nothing about the ending suggested the fight was over. If anything, it planted the idea that this exact same argument over the exact same subject was likely to come back around again in some form down the road. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That prediction turned out to be accurate almost immediately. Just 4 years later, South Park would return to this same subject matter for its landmark 200th episode, this time facing consequences far more serious than a network choosing to insert a black screen. Where Cartoon Wars dealt with hypothetical fear and institutional caution, the story that followed would involve real, specific threats aimed directly at the people who made the show, pulling South Park into a conflict unlike anything it had faced before. Section 4, Trapped in the Closet and the Isaac Hayes Exit. For nearly 9 years, South Park had one voice that never changed, one actor who had been there since the very beginning, lending his deep, distinctive tone to a school cafeteria worker named Chef. Isaac Hayes was not just a voice actor picked up for a cartoon job. He was already a legend in the music world long before South Park ever existed, known for his work as a singer, songwriter, and composer, including his famous theme song for the movie Shaft, which had earned him major awards years before Trey Parker and Matt Stone ever approached him. His presence gave the show a strange kind of credibility in its early years, a real musical icon lending his voice to a crude cartoon about foul-mouthed children in a small mountain town. That long relationship between Hayes and the show came to an end in 2006, and the reason behind it stayed murky and disputed for almost 2 decades afterward. The episode at the center of this story is called Trapped in the Closet. It aired on November 16th, 2005, as the 12th episode of the show's 9th season. The story follows Stan after he takes a personality test connected to Scientology, a real religious movement founded in the 1950s by the science fiction author L. Ron Hubbard. Within the world of the episode, Stan's test results come back so unusually high that Scientology leaders declare him the reincarnation of Hubbard himself, the only other person in the organization's history to score that well. This announcement sets off a chain reaction, with Scientologists from around the world flooding into South Park to meet their supposed new leader, including 2 of the religion's most famous real-world followers, actors Tom Cruise and John Travolta. The episode leans heavily into satire built around Tom Cruise specifically. After Stan tells Cruise that his acting has never impressed him, Cruise reacts by locking himself inside an actual closet and refusing to come out, triggering a media circus outside the house as reporters and fellow celebrities try to talk him into leaving. This moment gave the episode its title and also created one of the show's most quoted lines, with Stan's father Randy shouting through the door that Tom Cruise will not come out of the closet, a joke built around the phrase's double meaning that became instantly famous among fans regardless of their opinion on Scientology itself. Eventually, Stan publicly announces that he does not want to be the leader of Scientology or the reincarnation of anyone, ending the chaos and closing out the episode's central storyline. Beyond the celebrity comedy, the episode included content aimed much more directly at Scientology's actual beliefs and internal structure. It depicted the process the religion calls auditing, using a device inside the show designed to closely resemble Scientology's real-world e-meter, a tool used within the religion to measure a person's spiritual state during counseling sessions. The episode also included a lengthy on-screen text explanation, presented in a serious, factual tone, walking through the story of a figure named Xenu, described within Scientology's own internal teachings as an ancient intergalactic ruler tied to the origins of human suffering, according to the religion's more advanced, typically confidential teachings. Before this section aired, the show displayed text stating plainly that everything about to be shown represented what Scientologists actually believe, framing the entire sequence less as comedy and more as a direct, almost documentary-style explanation aimed at exposing internal religious teachings to a mainstream audience who would otherwise have no access to that information at all. This approach did not come out of nowhere. Trey Parker has explained in later interviews that the show had actually avoided making a full episode about Scientology for years, specifically because of Isaac Hayes. Parker described knowing that Hayes was a committed Scientologist and choosing, out of respect for their working relationship, to leave the religion alone as a subject, rather than risk creating tension with someone the show relied on and genuinely liked working with. According to Parker, it was Hayes himself, simply by being part of the show, who had kept Scientology off the table as a topic for South Park during those earlier years. What eventually changed that decision involved a friendship connected to a completely different source. Parker and Stone were close with the comedian and magician Penn Jillette, known for his television show at the time called Penn and Teller Bullshit, a series built around investigating and criticizing various beliefs and practices the host considered dishonest or harmful. Jillette had reportedly wanted to produce an episode of his own show taking on Scientology directly, only to find himself blocked from doing so by the network airing his program, out of concern over the kind of legal and public pressure Scientology was known for applying against its critics. Hearing about this situation reportedly played a role in pushing Parker and Stone toward finally deciding to tackle the subject themselves, treating the moment less as picking a random new target and more as stepping into a fight that a friend had been prevented from having on his own platform. Once the episode aired, its most immediate and widely reported piece of trivia involved its ending credits. Rather than listing the real names of the writers, editors, and production staff who worked on the episode, the closing credits for Trapped in the Closet replaced every single name with the same two placeholder names, John Smith and Jane Smith, repeated over and over throughout the entire list. This unusual choice was widely understood at the time as a joking but pointed reference to Scientology's well-known reputation for aggressively pursuing legal action against anyone it viewed as attacking the religion. Inside the episode itself, Stan even directly dares Scientologists to sue him during one of the final scenes, and the anonymous credits appeared designed to reflect that same defiant, expect to be sued attitude among the people who actually made the episode. The episode aired without significant incident in the United States at first, drawing plenty of attention and strong reactions online and in entertainment news coverage, but not triggering any immediate action from the network to pull or edit it. That changed a few months later when the episode reached audiences overseas. In January of 2006, Comedy Central's affiliate operating in the United Kingdom made the decision to remove Trapped in the Closet from its broadcast schedule entirely, choosing not to air a planned rerun. Reporting connected to the decision at the time suggested this move came in response to concern over possible legal action from Tom Cruise, whose portrayal within the episode had been especially pointed and personal compared to the show's usual style of celebrity mockery. Some later reporting went further, suggesting Cruise had applied pressure connected to promotional obligations for an upcoming film, reportedly threatening to skip promotional work for the movie Mission Impossible 3 if the network continued airing the episode, though the exact details behind this specific claim have remained difficult to fully confirm with total certainty across different sources covering the story. The most significant and lasting consequence connected to Trapped in the Closet had nothing to do with international broadcast schedules or celebrity lawsuits, though. It involved Isaac Hayes himself, and the sudden, confusing end to his nearly decade-long role on the show. According to Matt Stone, in comments made publicly not long after the episode aired, Hayes came to speak with him personally sometime shortly after Trapped in the Closet had already been broadcast. Stone described the conversation as making it fairly obvious that someone had encouraged or pressured Hayes into raising concerns about the episode and requesting it be pulled, even though the episode had already aired by that point, making any request to cancel it somewhat pointless on a practical level. Stone and Parker chose not to tell Hayes ahead of time that the episode was even being made, a decision Stone later explained as an attempt to give Hayes what he called plausible deniability, protecting him from being held personally responsible for content connected to a show that was about to publicly mock his own religion. 4 months after the episode originally aired, in March of 2006, a public statement was released under Isaac Hayes' name announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement framed his departure as a matter of personal conscience, explaining that while there is a place in the world for satire, a line exists where satire crosses over into intolerance and bigotry directed at the religious beliefs of others. Matt Stone responded publicly to this statement at the time, telling reporters that the situation was entirely connected to Hayes' faith, and pointing out what he saw as a clear double standard, noting that Hayes had never once objected to years of jokes aimed at Christianity throughout the show's run, despite cashing plenty of paychecks connected to that same content. Stone argued that wanting a different standard applied specifically to protect one's own religion, while accepting jokes aimed at every other religion represented exactly the kind of intolerance the statement itself claimed to be against. For years following this public exchange, the general understanding among fans and entertainment reporters was straightforward. Isaac Hayes had quit the show out of genuine religious conviction, upset by the direct and detailed mockery aimed at Scientology, and that decision marked the end of his time voicing Chef. This version of events held up publicly for well over a decade, repeated consistently across interviews, articles, and retrospectives looking back at the show's history. The full picture became far more complicated after Hayes passed away in 2008, just 2 years after his departure from the show. His son, Isaac Hayes III, eventually came forward publicly, years later, with a very different account of what had actually happened behind the scenes. According to Hayes' son, his father had suffered a serious stroke in January of 2006, just weeks before that public resignation statement was released. The stroke reportedly left Hayes unable to speak clearly and severely limited in his ability to understand or process what was happening around him, forcing him to relearn basic skills afterward, including simple physical tasks like playing the piano again. Given this condition, Hayes' son argued that his father could not have possibly made an informed, independent decision to resign from anything during that period, let alone crafted a detailed public statement explaining his reasoning for leaving a television show. Instead, according to this later account, the people surrounding Hayes at the time, described as almost entirely connected to Scientology in some way, including his personal assistants and close associates, were the ones responsible for putting together and releasing the resignation statement, using Hayes' name and reputation without him being in any real position to understand or approve of what was being said on his behalf. Hayes' son stated this plainly in public comments, insisting that his father did not quit South Park, and that instead, the people around him effectively made that decision for him during a period when he had no meaningful ability to resist or clarify what was actually happening. This revelation, arriving many years after the fact, completely reshaped how the entire episode of Hayes' departure should be understood. What had long been treated as a clear-cut story about one man standing up for his religious beliefs against a show mocking his faith turned into something far murkier, involving questions about a vulnerable man's health, the people who surrounded him during a moment of serious vulnerability, and how much of the public narrative around his exit had ever actually reflected his own genuine wishes at all. Following Hayes' departure, whatever the true circumstances behind it, the show had to figure out how to handle the character of Chef going forward, given that the actor who had voiced him for nearly a decade was no longer part of the production. Rather than simply recasting the role with a new actor, Parker and Stone chose a different path entirely. When the show's 10th season began in 2006, it opened with an episode giving Chef a dramatic and unusual send-off, splicing together old recorded dialogue Hayes had provided over the years to construct new lines for the character one final time, since no new material could be recorded going forward. Within the story itself, Chef is depicted as having been brainwashed by an organization the show portrays as a strange cult-like club, ultimately leading to his violent death, followed by a grotesque and darkly comedic final indignity involving his body after he passed classes. The episode did not shy away from continuing to poke fun at Scientology even during Chef's send-off. At the character's funeral within the story, Kyle delivers a line suggesting the town should not be upset with Chef for leaving, but instead direct that anger toward the fictional cult-like organization responsible for what happened to him. A clear continuation of the same underlying joke connecting back to the real-world situation surrounding Hayes' actual departure from the show months earlier. Taken together, the story surrounding Trapped in the Closet represents one of the more layered and complicated chapters in South Park's long history with controversy. Unlike earlier situations involving straightforward network censorship or a widely publicized international backlash, this particular story unfolded slowly and stayed genuinely uncertain for a very long time, only becoming somewhat clearer nearly 20 years after the actual events took place. And even then, relying on one family member's account rather than any kind of definitive, universally agreed upon record of exactly what happened during those final months of Hayes' life. It also reveals something distinct about how South Park's history with controversy did not always involve outside groups attacking the show or government stepping in to block content. Sometimes the consequences played out entirely internally, tangled up with the personal life and health of someone connected directly to the production itself, turning what looked publicly like a straightforward moral stand into something far more complicated and, ultimately, far sadder once the full picture eventually came into view. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Trapped in the Closet showed how far South Park was willing to go, naming a real organization outright and accepting whatever came next, even the loss of a longtime cast member. That same willingness would return a few years later, this time pulling the show into something far more serious than legal pressure. What came next involved real, direct threats of violence aimed at the two men behind the show. Section 5, Episode 200, Baiting the Line. By the time South Park reached its 14th season, the show had already survived over a decade of network fights, quiet edits, and one deeply personal loss connected to the Scientology episode a few years earlier. Nothing that had happened up to that point, though, quite prepared anyone for what came next. In April of 2010, the show decided to mark a major milestone, its 200th episode, with a celebration built entirely around every controversial choice the show had ever made. Instead of playing it safe for the occasion, Trey Parker and Matt Stone did the opposite, building a story that pulled together nearly every major target the show had ever mocked and placed Muhammad directly back at the center of the plot. Years after the fight over Cartoon Wars had already shown exactly how dangerous that subject could become. The episode is simply called 200. It aired on April 14th, 2010 as the 5th episode of the show's 14th season, and as the title suggests, it marked the 200th episode in the entire series. Trey Parker wrote and directed the episode, continuing the same hands-on approach to production that had defined the show since its earliest days. Rather than treating the milestone as a simple victory lap looking back at old jokes, Parker and Stone used it to set up a much bigger story, one designed to connect directly to a conflict the show had already faced once before and clearly had no intention of dropping. The plot begins with the return of a familiar face from the show's history, the celebrity actor and comedian Tom Cruise, whose portrayal on the show had already caused real problems years earlier during the Scientology episode. This time, Cruise shows up furious, claiming that years of being mocked on South Park have permanently damaged his reputation and his career. Rather than simply complaining, Cruise takes it a step further, organizing a massive class action lawsuit against the town itself, pulling in roughly 200 other celebrities who had also been mocked by the show over the years, all demanding compensation for the damage they claim South Park has done to their public image. This setup alone gave Parker and Stone an excuse to bring back years of previous celebrity targets in a single episode, creating a kind of highlight reel of past jokes wrapped inside a new story. Among the celebrities joining Cruise in the lawsuit is the musician Kanye West, continuing a joke from an earlier episode mocking his reaction to negative reviews of one of his music videos. Mel Gibson also appears as part of the group, tied to previous jokes the show had made about controversial moments in his personal and public life. Rather than simply cameo appearances, these characters actively drive the plot forward, banding together as a united front demanding the town pay for years of ridicule. At the center of the celebrity group's demand sits a very specific request. According to the plot, Cruise and his fellow celebrities believe the only way to finally get revenge on South Park and stop being mocked is to get their hands on Muhammad, who the celebrities believe holds a special kind of protection that prevents anyone from making fun of him. This idea plays directly off the real-world aftermath of the Cartoon Wars controversy from 2006, when Comedy Central had refused to allow any visual depiction of Muhammad following the Danish cartoon crisis and the resulting global unrest. Within the story, the celebrities want to essentially borrow that same protection for themselves, believing that if they can associate themselves closely enough with Muhammad, they too will become untouchable, safe from criticism or mockery of any kind. To pull this plan together, the episode also brings back Cartman's occasional but recurring superhero team from years earlier, the Super Best Friends, the same group of religious figures introduced in the Season 5 episode discussed earlier in this story. Muhammad appears again as part of this team, alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and the other figures from that original lineup, called upon once more to help deal with the chaos unfolding around the town. Throughout the episode, the show plays a specific and very deliberate game with how it chooses to show or hide Muhammad on screen. Rather than displaying him openly, the episode repeatedly finds creative ways to obscure his image without technically avoiding him altogether. At different points, he appears hidden behind a censorship box clearly marked with the word censored, tucked inside a moving truck where only a small hint of his outline can be seen, and eventually shown wearing a full bear costume covering his entire body and face so that nothing about his actual appearance is ever clearly visible to the audience. This approach let the show include Muhammad as an active character driving parts of the plot forward while technically avoiding ever showing an actual clear image of him, treating the entire situation almost like a running joke about the absurdity of the restrictions the show had been forced to operate under since 2006. Alongside the human celebrity storyline, the episode also brings back another classic South Park element, the giant mechanical robot version of the singer Barbra Streisand, a recurring monster character the show had used in earlier seasons to represent celebrity ego taken to a destructive, over-the-top extreme. In this episode, the robot version of Streisand goes on a rampage through the town, tying into the larger chaos playing out as the celebrity lawsuit conflict spirals further out of control. The episode ends without fully resolving the main conflict, deliberately setting up a direct continuation the following week, rather than wrapping everything up in a single standalone story. This structure meant that 200 functioned less like a complete self-contained celebration episode, and more like the opening half of a much larger two-part story, with its sequel expected to pick up immediately where it left off and finally answer the questions the first episode had left hanging in the air. When 200 aired, the reaction split in a familiar pattern for the show by that point. Longtime fans and many television critics responded with strong praise, viewing the episode as one of the sharpest and most ambitious things South Park had done in years, successfully weaving together over a decade of running jokes and past controversies into a single coherent story. According to audience measurement data collected at the time, the episode became the most watched program across all of cable television for that particular night, drawing an audience of roughly 3.3 million viewers, according to figures reported by Nielsen Media Research, a strong number reflecting just how much attention the show's milestone episode had managed to generate. The episode also received a level of formal recognition that placed it among the more respected entries in the show's long history. Later that year, 200 earned a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, an honor shared with its sequel episode 201 once that episode had also aired. This nomination reflected a certain irony worth noting directly. An episode built almost entirely around mocking censorship, celebrity outrage, and the show's own history of controversy ended up earning one of television's most respected industry honors, even as the exact same episode sat at the center of a growing real-world controversy that had not even fully played out yet by the time the nomination was announced. Reaction to the episode was not universally positive, though, and some of the criticism came from a direction that had little to do with religion or free speech at all. The show's long-running satirical target, the Parents Television Council, weighed in on the episode as it had done many times before across the years, continuing its consistent pattern of labeling South Park content as inappropriate or harmful, regardless of the specific subject matter involved in any given episode. This particular strand of criticism represented one of the more predictable and ongoing conflicts connected to the show, distinct from the much larger and more serious storm that was still building around the Muhammad storyline specifically, one that would not fully reveal itself until after the second half of the story aired the following week. What makes 200 stand apart from earlier moments in South Park's history with controversy comes down to timing and intention working together in a very specific way. The show had already gone through the Cartoon Wars conflict 4 years earlier, fully aware at that point of exactly how sensitive the subject of depicting Muhammad had become following the real-world violence connected to the Danish cartoon crisis. Rather than than avoiding the subject after having already faced network resistance over it once, Parker and Stone chose to return to it directly, using their 200th episode milestone specifically as the moment to revisit and escalate the exact same conflict all over again. This was not an accidental brush with controversy the way the earlier fire scene cut had been, and it was not a case of an old, mostly forgotten episode getting swept up years later into rules created by unrelated events, the way Super Best Friends had been affected. This was a deliberate, calculated decision to walk directly back into the most dangerous subject the show had ever tackled, fully aware of the history already attached to it. The choice to obscure Muhammad through the censorship box, the moving truck, and the bear costume also reflected a specific kind of creative problem solving unique to this particular episode. Rather than simply refusing to include him at all or fighting the network directly over showing him clearly on screen, the way the Cartoon Wars conflict had played out, Parker and Stone found a way to include the character as an active part of the plot while working entirely within the restrictions already established years earlier. This approach let the show continue engaging with the subject of censorship itself as a running joke throughout the episode, using the absurdity of hiding a character in increasingly ridiculous ways as a form of commentary on how strange the entire situation had become in the years since the original Cartoon Wars controversy first forced those restrictions into place. It is worth remembering that at the moment 200 first aired, none of the real-world consequences that would eventually follow had happened yet. The episode existed for exactly 1 week as simply a wildly ambitious, critically praised celebration of the show's long history, generating strong ratings and plenty of positive attention without any organized threat or serious backlash attached to it during that initial window. The episode ended on a cliffhanger specifically because Parker and Stone had already planned a second half to the story, intending to resolve the celebrity lawsuit plot and finally reveal how the town would handle the demand to hand over Muhammad in the episode that would air exactly 1 week later. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nobody watching that first week had any way of knowing what was coming. Within days, the sequel episode would pull South Park into real, explicit threats of violence aimed directly at Parker and Stone, forcing a level of security and public debate the show had never faced before. The celebration was about to become something else entirely. Section 6. The Threat. The second half of South Park's 200th episode celebration was supposed to simply finish the story left hanging 1 week earlier. Instead, it became the moment the show's decade-long relationship with controversy turned into something far more serious than a network disagreement or a quiet internal edit. For the first time in the show's history, the people making it faced a direct and specific warning about their own personal safety, forcing a level of real-world security response that had never been part of the South Park story before. The episode is called 201. It aired on April 21st, 2010, 1 week after 200, continuing directly from where the earlier episode had left things unresolved. Trey Parker wrote and directed the episode, just as he had done with its predecessor, picking the story back up with the town of South Park still caught in the middle of the celebrity lawsuit plot and the ongoing search for Muhammad, believed by Tom Cruise and his group of angry celebrities to hold some kind of special protection that made him impossible to mock. The episode resolves several storylines left open from the previous week. Cartman, continuing to search for a way to hand Muhammad over to the celebrities in hopes of avoiding their lawsuit, eventually learns the actual reason behind Muhammad's apparent immunity from ridicule. Rather than any kind of magical power, the explanation given within the story comes down to something far simpler and more grounded, tied directly to fear and the threat of violence, rather than anything supernatural. This resolution set up the episode's final scene, which would go on to become one of the most talked about and most heavily altered moments in the show's entire history. At the end of the episode, the character Kyle delivers a closing speech, following the show's long-running pattern of having Kyle wrap up major storylines with a short, sincere message directed at the town. This particular speech carried more weight than most of Kyle's previous closing moments, built specifically to explain the actual points behind the entire two-part story. Rather than framing the message as being about Muhammad specifically, Kyle's speech focused on the idea that nothing about the situation involved any kind of real magic or special protection at all. Instead, the speech argued that the only real power at play throughout the entire story came from the simple act of threatening people with violence, pointing out that fear of violence, not respect or reverence, was the true reason certain things could not be shown or discussed openly. The speech extended this point by connecting it to the show's own recurring character Kyle, drawing a comparison to the harassment his fellow classmates classmate Kenny had once faced over his physical appearance, suggesting that the same basic logic applied everywhere, and that giving into threats simply teaches people that making threats works. When 201 was originally written and recorded, this closing speech existed as a complete, clearly audible piece of dialogue, delivered the same way any other major speech in the show's history had been presented. What actually reached television screens on the night of April 21st, 2010 looked nothing like what Parker and Stone had intended. Comedy Central made the decision to heavily alter the episode before it aired, going far beyond anything the network had done during the earlier Cartoon Wars controversy 4 years earlier. The reason behind this decision traced back to events that had unfolded in the days immediately following the broadcast of 200 the previous week. A radical organization based in New York, calling itself Revolution Muslim, posted a message on its website responding directly to the appearance of Muhammad hidden inside a bear costume during that earlier episode. The post did not stop at simple criticism or disagreement with the show's content. It included a message warning Trey Parker and Matt Stone that continuing to depict Muhammad in this way put them at risk of ending up like Theo van Gogh, a real Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in 2004 following the release of a short film he had made criticizing the treatment of women within certain interpretations of Islam. Alongside this warning, the post included a graphic photograph connected to Van Gogh's actual killing, using the real, violent death of another filmmaker as a way of illustrating exactly what kind of consequence the post was suggesting Parker and Stone might face. The individual behind the post, identified in later reporting as a man using the name Abu Talha al-Amriki, spoke publicly about his reasoning after the story drew national attention. According to comments he gave to reporters at the time, he described the post as an attempt to raise awareness, explaining that including the graphic image of Van Gogh's death was meant to help explain how seriously he believed the situation should be taken. He maintained that the post was not meant as a direct threat, describing it instead as a warning about what he believed could realistically happen as a consequence of the show's content. Though the distinction between a warning and a threat mattered very little to the people responsible for the safety of everyone connected to the show. Law enforcement in New York took the situation seriously enough to respond directly. According to reporting from the time, the New York City Police Department increased security around the building housing Comedy Central's headquarters specifically in response to the post, treating the situation as something requiring an active precaution regardless of how credible the specific threat ultimately turned out to be. Officials investigating the matter reportedly concluded that Revolution Muslim itself functioned mostly as what one law enforcement description called all talk, noting that the small group behind the website had never actually carried out any acts of violence themselves. Despite that assessment, officials also expressed concern that the post itself, regardless of the original poster's own capability or intention, could potentially inspire someone else entirely, someone with no direct connection to Revolution Muslim at all, to act on the warning independently. Faced with this situation, Comedy Central made the decision to significantly alter 201 before it aired, going far beyond what had happened with earlier episodes touching on the same general subject. Every single reference to Muhammad's name throughout the episode was replaced with a loud, sharp beeping sound, removing any spoken mention of him entirely from the broadcast version. Visually, the character remained blocked from view, using the same kind of censorship techniques the show had already been using throughout both episodes, continuing the pattern established the previous week of hiding him behind boxes, disguises, and obscured camera angles. The most significant and widely discussed change involved Kyle's closing speech. Rather than allowing the message to play out clearly, Comedy Central inserted continuous, jarring beeping sounds over almost the entire length of the speech, technically leaving the audio track present underneath, but making it nearly impossible for anyone watching to actually understand what Kyle was saying. This left many viewers watching the episode live with the impression that the scene itself might be some kind of clever meta joke created by Parker and Stone, poking fun at censorship by deliberately making their own message impossible to hear. Parker and Stone addressed this misunderstanding directly and quickly after the episode aired. In a statement released not long after the broadcast, the two creators made clear that the heavy censorship covering Kyle's speech was not something they had planned or found funny in any way. They stated plainly that it was not intended as some kind of meta commentary on their part, explaining that the actual content of the speech had nothing to do with Muhammad directly at all, focusing instead on the broader idea of intimidation and fear, yet it still ended up bleeped out almost entirely by the network's decision. They closed their statement by noting that after 14 years of making the show, they had never before delivered an episode they could not fully stand stand behind, and confirmed they intended to return the following week with an entirely different episode covering a completely unrelated subject, adding, somewhat pointedly, that they would simply have to see what happened to that episode once it aired. Public reaction to Comedy Central's handling of 201 became a significant story in its own right, separate from the underlying threat that had prompted the network's decision in the first place. Commentators across a wide range of political perspectives weighed in on the situation, with much of the criticism focused specifically on the network rather than on Revolution Muslim itself. Fox News commentator Bill O'Reilly offered a mixed reaction, expressing admiration for Parker and Stone's willingness to take the risk, while also questioning whether the potential reward of making the episode was truly worth the danger involved. British writer Douglas Murray took a different position, arguing that the entire situation actually proved the exact point South Park had been trying to make about intimidation, suggesting that Revolution Muslim's post had inadvertently confirmed everything the show argued about fear driving censorship rather than respect. The controversy also became a major topic on other television programs at the time. On an episode of Comedy Central's own program, The Daily Show, airing the day after 201 originally broadcast, host Jon Stewart spent an extended segment addressing the situation directly, delivering a lengthy and pointed response criticizing what he described as the contradiction between Revolution Muslim's members making public threats connected to free expression while personally benefiting from the same American freedoms that allowed them to post such messages in the first place. Despite the seriousness of everything surrounding its release, 201 received the same formal industry recognition as its predecessor. Along with 200, the episode earned a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program later that year, placing 2 episodes built directly around one of the most dangerous controversies in the show's history, alongside some of the most respected work in television animation for that entire season. The long-term consequences connected to 201 turned out to be far more permanent than anything the show had experienced before. Unlike Cartoon Wars, which eventually became available again through various releases despite its own censorship history, both 200 and 201 disappeared from circulation almost entirely following their original broadcasts. Neither episode aired again on Comedy Central after that initial week, and neither one appeared on the network's website or on any streaming platform carrying the show going forward. According to reporting from February of 2011, nearly a year after the episodes originally aired, it was confirmed that 200 would finally become available again through a DVD release, though 201 continued to face a much more restricted path back into public availability even after that announcement. To this day, both episodes remain absent from Paramount+, the primary streaming home for the vast majority of South Park's massive episode library, making them among the small handful of episodes in the show's entire history that fans cannot access through any official current platform. Looking at 201 alongside everything that came before it in South Park's long history with censorship reveals just how different this particular situation truly was. The fire scene cut from the earliest season had come from a quiet, internal decision with no outside pressure attached to it at all. Super Best Friends had faded into restricted status years after the fact, swept up by rules created because of separate, unrelated events. Cartoon Wars had involved a real fight with the network, but one grounded entirely in institutional caution and corporate concern rather than any specific personal danger aimed at anyone by name. Even the Scientology controversy, as complicated and ultimately sad as it turned out to be regarding Isaac Hayes, never involved anyone suggesting Parker and Stone themselves might be physically harmed. 201 broke that pattern completely. For the first time, the show's creators were dealing with an actual, specific warning connecting their own personal safety to a real-world act of violence that had already happened to someone else in a similar situation. The response required real security measures at an actual physical location, involved direct police assessment of the credibility of the threat, and forced Comedy Central into a level of censorship far beyond anything it had ever applied to the show before, altering not just a single image, but stripping the meaning out of an entire closing speech built around the exact subject the thread itself had been about. There is a particular irony sitting at the center of everything connected to 201 that stayed with the story long after the initial controversy faded from daily headlines. The speech Comedy Central chose to censor most heavily was not actually about Muhammad at all. It was a message specifically about how fear of violence, rather than respect, ends up controlling what gets shown and what gets silenced. By bleeping that exact message into incoherence, the network ended up accidentally proving the very point the speech itself had been trying to make, using fear of a threat to silence a message about how fear silences things. mistakes, wrapped inside the same 22 minutes of television. What happened with 200 and 201 marked a clear turning point in how seriously the outside world began treating South Park's willingness to tackle dangerous subjects. Up until this point, the show's various fights with censorship, however serious individually, had mostly stayed contained within the world of television networks, legal threats, and public debate. This time, the conflict had reached all the way into the realm of actual physical safety, backed by real police involvement and a specific named historical example of exactly what kind of violence the warning was referencing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shift in stakes did not stay confined to the United States or to religious controversy specifically. Less than a decade later, South Park would find itself facing an entirely different kind of consequence. This time triggered not by a small extremist group operating out of New York, but by an entire national government reacting to a single episode with a level of coordinated censorship that made even the events surrounding 201 look comparatively small in scale. Section 7. Banned in China. By the time South Park reached its 23rd season, the show had already survived death threats, network censorship, and the loss of a longtime cast member. Nothing up to that point had ever caused an entire country to erase every trace of the show from its own version of the internet within a matter of days. That changed in October of 2019, when a single episode about censorship itself managed to get the show censored on a scale nobody connected to South Park had ever experienced before. The episode responsible is called Banned in China. It aired on October 2nd, 2019, as the second episode of the show's 23rd season, and it holds the distinction of being the 299th episode of the series overall. The story follows two separate but connected plots, both built around the same central idea: the lengths modern companies and creative people go to avoid upsetting the Chinese government in order to keep doing business inside China's massive consumer market. The first storyline follows Randy Marsh, the father of central character Stan, as he looks for new ways to expand his marijuana growing business. Randy learns that many other companies have already found success by moving their operations toward China, hoping to cash in quickly on the size of the Chinese market. Following that same idea, Randy travels to China himself, hoping to find similar opportunities there. Almost immediately after arriving, Randy gets caught at a Chinese airport with marijuana in his luggage, and Chinese authorities respond by arresting him and sending him to a prison labor camp, a facility where prisoners are forced to work and undergo ideological instruction tied to the Chinese Communist Party. While imprisoned, Randy is forced to recite pro-Communist Party propaganda alongside other prisoners as part of the daily routine inside the camp. During this experience, Randy encounters a surprising fellow prisoner, a character depicted as an imprisoned version of Winnie the Pooh accompanied by Piglet. This detail connects directly to a real event from several years earlier. Around 2013, comparisons began spreading online between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the character Winnie the Pooh, based on photographs where people online noted a visual resemblance between the two. Rather than ignoring the comparison, Chinese officials responded by heavily restricting and censoring references to Winnie the Pooh across Chinese media and the internet, treating the comparison as a serious insult to the country's leader. The 2018 film Christopher Robin, built around the same character, ended up blocked from release in Chinese theaters entirely as a result of this ongoing sensitivity. Banned in China directly referenced this real censorship history by depicting Winnie the Pooh as a literal prisoner inside its story, using the joke to highlight just how far Chinese censorship had already gone regarding one children's cartoon character years before South Park ever got involved. As Randy's ordeal continues inside the labor camp, the episode escalates the joke further by introducing a version of the Disney character Mickey Mouse, portrayed within the story as a ruthless enforcer working to make sure companies and individual creators stay in line with the demands of Chinese censors. This version of Mickey threatens various companies, mascots, and staff members throughout the episode, built as a pointed exaggeration of the real business relationship between major American entertainment companies and the Chinese government, given how much revenue those companies stood to lose if their products were banned from the Chinese market. The second storyline running alongside Randy's imprisonment follows several of the show's younger characters, including Stan, Kenny, Butters, and Jimmy, as they form a metal band together. After gaining unexpected international success and fame, the band receives an offer to make a movie, but quickly discovers that securing this deal means their script and story need to be repeatedly revised to satisfy Chinese government censors before the film can move forward. A film producer character within the episode explains this requirement directly, stating plainly that for the movie to actually make money, it needs to clear Chinese censorship standards. That same character lists off several specific subjects the movie absolutely absolutely cannot include if the band wants their deal to succeed, naming the Dalai Lama, homosexuality, organ transplants, and Winnie the Pooh as topics considered too sensitive or forbidden for Chinese audiences and regulators. One particular line of dialogue from this storyline became especially well known after the episode aired, spoken by the producer character pressuring the band to compromise their creative vision. The line argues that anyone hoping to succeed financially by working with China needs to lower their standards regarding personal freedom if they want access to that much money, phrased in a blunt, memorable way that captured the entire point of the episode in a single sentence. Elsewhere in the episode, one of the boys in the band comments directly on the strange reality facing young audiences in America, pointing out that kids growing up at that time were mostly only allowed to see movies that had already been approved by Chinese censors, regardless of where those movies were actually made or intended to be shown first. The episode does not stop at fictional companies and characters when making its point. It directly name-checks and mocks real businesses and organizations that had drawn criticism for adjusting their behavior to avoid upsetting the Chinese government. This included references to the well-known changes made to the movie Top Gun: Maverick, where reports at the time indicated that patches representing the flags of Taiwan and Japan, originally shown on a character's jacket in earlier versions of promotional material, appeared to have been altered or removed in newer versions, seemingly to avoid controversy connected to China's political positions regarding those two places. The episode also referenced the 2012 remake of the movie Red Dawn, a film where reporting at the time confirmed the villains originally written as invading Chinese soldiers were changed during editing to instead be soldiers from North Korea, a change widely understood as an attempt to avoid losing access to the massive Chinese box office by upsetting Chinese audiences and officials. Banned in China arrived at an especially sensitive moment connected to real-world events happening at almost exactly the same time. Just days before the episode aired, an executive working for the Houston Rockets basketball team, part of the American National Basketball Association, posted a message online expressing support for pro-democracy protests happening in Hong Kong at the time. The reaction from Chinese officials and Chinese business partners connected to the NBA was immediate and severe, leading to canceled broadcasts, pulled sponsorships, and a major financial and public relations crisis for the league within China specifically. This entire situation was unfolding publicly in the news at the exact same time South Park released an episode built around mocking companies that bend to Chinese pressure, giving the episode's satire an unusually direct and immediate real-world target to point toward. The reaction from Chinese authorities following the episode's release moved quickly and covered an enormous amount of ground. According to reporting from The Hollywood Reporter published shortly after the episode aired, nearly every trace of South Park disappeared from major Chinese internet platforms within days. This included the complete removal of episodes, clips, and any related content from Youku, a major Chinese streaming service owned by the technology company Alibaba. Searches conducted on Weibo, a Chinese social media platform often compared to Twitter and reportedly used by hundreds of millions of active users each month, turned up no mentions of South Park at all following the episode's release, despite the show having built up years of discussion and fan activity on the platform before that point. A discussion thread dedicated to the show on a Chinese platform called Tieba reportedly displayed a message stating that the section had been temporarily closed according to relevant laws and regulations, a phrase commonly used across Chinese platforms to indicate government-ordered content removal. Parker and Stone responded to this sweeping censorship with a public statement released on South Park's official social media account, written in a deliberately sarcastic tone matching the exact style of mock apology the show itself often used within its own episodes. The statement opened by comparing their own reaction to the NBA situation happening at the same time, stating that just like the NBA, South Park welcomed Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts, adding that they too loved money more than freedom and democracy. The statement continued by directly denying, in an obviously joking tone, that Xi Jinping looked anything like Winnie the Pooh, before reminding readers to tune into the show's upcoming 300th episode, and closing with a sarcastic wish for a bountiful autumn harvest connected to a Chinese agricultural product. Playing into the exaggerated, over-the-top style of forced apology the episode itself had just spent 22 minutes making fun of. This response spread quickly across entertainment news coverage and social media discussion in the days following its release, widely interpreted as Parker and Stone doubling down on the exact point their episode had already made, refusing to offer any kind of genuine apology despite the scale of the censorship response their episode had triggered. Rather than quietly accepting the situation the way many of the real companies referenced within the episode itself had done regarding their own past controversies with China, South South Park chose to respond publicly with more of the same satire that had caused the problem in the first place. The scale of the ban connected to Banned in China stands apart from every other instance of censorship in South Park's history covered so far, specifically because of who was doing the censoring and how completely they were able to carry it out. Earlier conflicts involving Comedy Central editing specific scenes, or even the extreme censorship applied to 201 following the Revolution Muslim threat, still involved a single American media company making decisions about American broadcast content. The reaction connected to Banned in China involved an entire national government using its direct control over domestic internet platforms to erase a foreign television show almost entirely from public access within its own borders, a level of coordinated censorship far beyond anything any single television network could ever accomplish on its own. This difference highlights something important about the specific kind of power China holds over global media companies that simply does not exist in most other countries. Unlike smaller organizations or extremist groups whose influence depends mostly on generating fear or public pressure, the Chinese government controls direct access to its own massive internet infrastructure and consumer market, giving it the practical ability to instantly remove content across an entire country's streaming services and social media platforms the moment officials decide something crosses an unacceptable line. Banned in China existed specifically to point out how much influence this kind of control gives China over major entertainment companies desperate to access hundreds of millions of potential customers, and the near-instant total censorship response that followed the episode's release ended up serving as a real-world demonstration proving the exact point the episode had just finished making. Unlike the story of 200 and 201, where the underlying threat came from a small, largely powerless group whose influence depended mostly on fear rather than actual capability, the response to Banned in China came from an entity with the genuine power to follow through completely on its reaction, backed by direct control over the platforms where any pushback or continued discussion might otherwise have taken place. There was no equivalent to the NYPD assessing credibility or law enforcement debating how seriously to take the situation. The ban simply happened, quickly, thoroughly, and without any real avenue for South Park or its network to negotiate or appeal the decision in any meaningful way. The financial stakes connected to this kind of ban also help explain why so many other companies had chosen to quietly adjust their content rather than risk this exact outcome. The same behavior Banned in China had specifically set out to mock in the first place. Losing access to the Chinese market represents an enormous financial loss for major entertainment companies given the sheer size of the population and consumer base involved. South Park itself, airing primarily through Comedy Central and produced by an American company, did not depend directly on Chinese revenue the way a major theatrical film release or a company like the NBA relied on Chinese broadcast deals and sponsorships. This difference likely gave Parker and Stone significantly more freedom to respond to the ban with mockery rather than any kind of genuine concern about lasting financial consequences, a luxury not every company or public figure caught in a similar situation with China has been able to afford. Looking back at the entire chain of events connected to Banned in China, from the episode's original content mocking real censorship practices, to the real-world NBA controversy unfolding at almost the exact same time, to the sweeping and immediate Chinese government response erasing the show from its domestic internet, the story stands as one of the clearest examples in television history of a piece of satire immediately proving its own point through the real-world reaction it generated. Few episodes of any television show have ever managed to predict and then directly trigger the exact kind of response they were built specifically to criticize, all within the span of just a few days following release. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This moment marked a real shift in scale. What began with one network worried about copycat fire behavior had grown into a full government wielding control over its own internet. The next chapter would raise the stakes even higher, pulling South Park into a direct public clash with the President of the United States and the White House itself. Section 8. A sitting president fights back. South Park had spent nearly 3 decades running into trouble with religious groups, foreign governments, and the network that aired it. What the show had never faced in all that time was a direct public response from the President of the United States and his own official staff. That changed in the summer of 2025 when the show came back from a 2-year break and used its very first new episode to walk straight into the middle of a real, ongoing, legal and political fight involving its own parent company, turning a season premiere into one of the most talked about pieces pieces of television that entire year. The episode responsible is called Sermon on the Mount. It aired on July 23, 2025, marking the start of the show's 27th season and the first new episode to air after South Park had gone nearly 2 full years without any fresh material. The gap itself had been driven by ongoing negotiations between Trey Parker, Matt Stone, and Paramount, the company that owned both Comedy Central and the streaming platform Paramount Plus, over a new deal to keep the show running well into the future. That deal eventually came together, reportedly worth well over $1 billion, and it guaranteed years of additional new episodes going forward. Once the agreement was finalized, all attention shifted toward exactly how the show would choose to return, and the answer turned out to be as direct and pointed as anything the creators had ever produced. The premiere arrived during an unusually tense moment for the entire company behind the show. Paramount had spent the previous several months dealing with a lawsuit filed by President Donald Trump connected to how the network's news program, 60 Minutes, had edited an interview with his political opponent during the previous year's election. At the same time, Paramount was working to finalize a massive merger with another media company called Skydance, a deal that needed approval from federal regulators before it could move forward. Many observers connected these two situations directly, suggesting that Paramount's leadership had strong financial incentive to settle the lawsuit and avoid antagonizing the administration while regulatory approval for the merger remained pending. Just weeks before South Park's premiere, this tension became public in a very visible way when CBS, another network owned by Paramount, announced that it was ending The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, a long-running late-night program hosted by a comedian known for frequently and sharply criticizing Trump. CBS framed the decision as a financial one, connected to the show's costs and ratings, but the timing led many people in entertainment and news coverage to question whether the cancellation had more to do with avoiding further conflict with the administration during such a sensitive period for the company's pending merger. South Park's premiere walked directly into this exact situation, referencing the Colbert cancellation, the Paramount lawsuit, and the broader fear that a media company might be willing to quiet its own critics in order to protect a business deal. Rather than avoiding the subject or waiting for the controversy to settle down, Parker and Stone built their season opener specifically around it, using the same real-world tension surrounding their own network as material for the show itself. The episode's plot centers on the town of South Park dealing with a religious controversy of its own, distinct from the political story unfolding at the national level. The school principal decides to bring Jesus into a school assembly, a decision that quickly divides the town's parents and leads to open conflict at the community level. This local storyline runs alongside a separate set of scenes depicting President Trump directly, giving the episode two connected threads, one focused on the fictional town's own religious dispute, and one focused squarely on real-world politics playing out at the White House. The way the episode chose to depict Trump broke from the show's usual visual style in a very specific and deliberate way. Rather than drawing him using the same simple, cutout-inspired look the show gives every other character, Parker and Stone instead used real photographs of Trump's actual face, placed onto an otherwise animated body. This gave the character an unsettling, uncanny appearance, completely different from any other person the show had ever depicted, making the choice itself feel like part of the joke, treating the sitting president as something almost too strange or too real to translate into the show's normal cartoon style. Several scenes throughout the episode place Trump inside the White House, dealing with various pieces of policy and personal behavior. One storyline touched on rising tariffs affecting trade with Canada, showing Trump responding to criticism about the economic impact by simply telling his critics to relax rather than engaging with the substance of their concerns. Another visual gag showed Trump personally decorating the walls of the White House with nude portraits of himself, an exaggerated and absurd image meant to mock his well-documented interest in his own public image and self-promotion. The episode's most widely discussed scene placed Trump in bed alongside Satan, a character who has appeared in South Park's world since some of its earliest years, often used as a stand-in for corrupting influence or forces working behind the scenes of major events. Within this scene, Satan makes comments mocking the size of Trump's body, and the conversation shifts into a confrontation over persistent public rumors connecting Trump's name to files related to Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy financier who had died in federal custody years earlier while facing serious criminal charges connected to sex trafficking involving minors. The rumors regarding a supposed list connected to Epstein's associates had circulated widely in the news and online for years by that point, and the episode used Satan's confrontation with Trump as a direct way of bringing that ongoing public speculation into the story. Inside the fictional town itself, one One particular moment carried the episode's most direct commentary on the entire situation surrounding Colbert's cancellation and the broader fear of government pressure shaping media decisions. Cartman appears wearing a shirt with a message declaring that a particular cultural movement, often labeled as woke, had died, continuing the show's long-running habit of mocking whatever political language happened to be dominating public conversation at any given moment. In a separate scene, Cartman makes a comment directly addressing the idea that the government could somehow force a show off the air, questioning out loud what program could possibly be targeted next if that kind of pressure became normal. The line worked as a wink toward the audience, directly acknowledging the real fear many people had been expressing about Colbert's situation, while placing that exact worry inside the mouth of one of the show's most famous characters. By the episode's end, the story shifts back toward its fictional political thread, showing Trump running into trouble with his own base of support after some of his followers within the town turn against him, upset specifically over his administration's handling of the Jesus in Schools controversy that had been dividing the town throughout the episode. This ending placed Trump in a position where his own supporters, rather than his usual political opponents, became the source of his biggest headache by the episode's final scenes, adding one more layer of complication to a story already juggling several separate political and religious threads at once. The reaction from the White House arrived quickly after the episode aired. According to a statement given to the entertainment publication Variety, White House spokesperson Taylor Rogers responded directly to the episode's content, framing the criticism South Park had received over the years for supposedly offensive material as hypocritical, given how quickly some of the same critics seemed willing to praise the show once it turned its attention toward mocking the president. This response marked a significant moment in the show's history, representing the first time an official spokesperson for a sitting president had issued a direct, on-record statement responding specifically to a South Park episode. This response stood apart from every previous instance of pushback the show had faced across nearly 3 decades on the air. Comedy Central's internal censorship decisions, going all the way back to the fire scene removed from an early season 1 episode, had always come from executives working inside a private company managing their own broadcast standards. The threats connected to episode 201 had come from a small, largely powerless extremist group with no official government authority behind it at all. The response from China regarding Banned in China had come from an actual government, but one operating entirely within its own borders, using tools available specifically because of how tightly it controlled its own domestic internet and media systems. The White House statement responding to Sermon on the Mount represented something different from all of these, a direct public reaction from the sitting president's own official communications team, responding to a piece of American entertainment within the same country where that entertainment had been produced and broadcast. At the same time, it is worth being precise about exactly what did and did not happen following this episode. Unlike the threats connected to 201, there was no indication of any actual danger to Parker, Stone, or anyone connected to producing the show. Unlike the response from China, there was no attempt by any American government agency to remove the episode from streaming platforms or block public access to it in any way. The episode remained fully available on Paramount Plus following its broadcast, and Comedy Central aired it without cutting, altering, or censoring any part of its content. The conflict here played out entirely through public statements and media coverage, a war of words rather than any concrete action taken to actually restrict or punish the show. This distinction matters because it highlights something specific about the moment South Park found itself in during 2025 compared to every earlier controversy covered so far. The fear driving public conversation around the show's return had nothing to do with South Park facing direct government censorship itself. It centered instead on worry connected to what had already happened to a different show entirely, Colbert's program, and whether that cancellation signaled a broader willingness among major media companies to quietly avoid angering the administration in order to protect their own business interests. South Park's decision to satirize this exact fear, using its own return to television as the platform for doing so, turned the show into a kind of test case for whether a major entertainment property could directly mock a sitting president without facing any serious consequence beyond a strongly worded public statement. The billion-dollar deal Parker and Stone had just signed with Paramount added another layer of context worth understanding here. Unlike many of the show's earlier fights with the network, where Comedy Central held significant leverage over what could or could not air, this new agreement had just locked in years of guaranteed future episodes and a massive financial commitment from the same company that owned both Comedy Central and Paramount Plus. This timing meant South Park returned to television at almost the exact exact moment, its own financial position with its parent company had never been stronger, giving Parker and Stone a level of security and leverage that likely made it easier for them to take the risk of directly mocking the president in their very first episode back, regardless of whatever tension existed between Paramount and the Trump administration connected to the separate lawsuit and merger situation. Public reaction to the episode split in familiar patterns that echoed almost every previous controversy the show had faced over the years. Supporters praised the episode as exactly the kind of fearless political commentary South Park had built its reputation on since the very beginning, arguing that the show's willingness to directly mock Trump proved media companies could still push back against political pressure rather than simply falling in line. Critics of the episode's content came from a different direction than usual, given that most of the show's harshest historical critics had traditionally come from groups objecting to crude humor or religious mockery, rather than from supporters of a specific president. This time, criticism came largely from Trump's political supporters, some of whom viewed the episode as an unfair and excessive personal attack, rather than legitimate political satire. There is a particular irony worth recognizing in how this entire situation unfolded, similar in structure to the irony found at the center of the 201 controversy years earlier. Sermon on the Mount used its own storyline to warn about the danger of media companies quietly bending to political pressure rather than risking conflict, built specifically around real fear connected to Colbert's cancellation. The White House response to the episode, framing years of past criticism against South Park as suddenly hypocritical simply because the show had turned its satire toward the president, arguably demonstrated exactly the kind of selective, situational reaction to criticism the episode itself had spent its runtime mocking. Whether intentional or not, the government's own response to the episode ended up echoing the same pattern of shifting standards depending on who happened to be the target of the joke, a pattern South Park had built its entire creative identity around calling out since its earliest years on the air. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This confrontation marked a clear high point, pulling South Park into conflict with network executives, extremist groups, foreign governments, and now the highest office in the country. Yet an even more urgent crisis was still weeks away, one triggered not by politics but by a sudden real act of violence connected to someone the show had just mocked. Section 9. Pulled after a real assassination. Just weeks after South Park's season premiere had already pulled the White House itself into a public argument with the show, an entirely different and far more serious situation forced Comedy Central into a decision unlike anything the network had faced before. This time, the crisis had nothing to do with ongoing political tension or a carefully planned piece of satire. It came down to a real person, recently mocked inside an episode, being killed in real life just weeks after that episode had aired, forcing the network to make an emergency call about a piece of content that suddenly carried a weight nobody involved in making it could have predicted. The episode responsible is called Gotta Nut. It aired on August 6, 2025 as the second episode of the show's 27th season, arriving just 2 weeks after the politically charged season premiere covered in the previous section. The episode focused most of its satire on several real figures connected to the Trump administration, particularly Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, Vice President J.D. Vance, and the federal agency responsible for enforcing immigration law, generally known by its abbreviation ICE. The main storyline follows a longtime South Park character named Mr. Mackey, the school counselor who has appeared throughout the series for decades, usually delivering simple, well-meaning advice to students despite his own often chaotic personal life. In this episode, Mr. Mackey finds himself dealing with a serious financial problem after losing his job. Sitting down with a bank representative to review his monthly expenses, Mackey learns that his total costs each month add up to an amount he had no idea was so high. The bank representative walks him through several possible solutions, including a debt consolidation loan, canceling his streaming subscriptions, downgrading his phone plan, and even taking out a second mortgage on his house. But each option still leaves him with the same large monthly bill hanging over him. Frustrated and desperate, Mackey explains that he cannot find any counseling work since nobody seems to be hiring in his field anymore. The bank representative responds by suggesting a different kind of job entirely, asking Mackey if he has considered working for ICE, specifically framing the position as an opportunity to help enforce immigration law by rounding up people living in the country without legal permission. This storyline runs alongside a second plot following one of the show's younger characters, a student named Clyde Donovan. Rather than joining a government agency the way Mackey ends up doing, Clyde takes a very different path, setting up a table at South Park Elementary and launching his own version of a political podcast aimed at provoking provoking and confronting other students over their political beliefs. Clyde adopts a specific persona for this project, inviting classmates to step up to a microphone and try to prove him wrong on various political topics, closely mirroring the real-world format used by conservative activist and media personality Charlie Kirk, who had built a large public following through college campus events built around exactly this same setup, inviting students to challenge him directly in open debate. The character of Eric Cartman also gets pulled into this storyline, launching his own competing podcast and adopting a hairstyle and general appearance closely resembling Kirk's actual look. Throughout the episode, Cartman and Clyde compete against each other, each trying to prove that his version of the provocative campus podcaster format is more successful or more authentic than the others. This competition builds toward the episode's most direct reference to Kirk, where Clyde ultimately receives an award referred to within the episode as the Charlie Kirk Award for Young Master Debaters, a title built around a play on words connecting the term for someone skilled in formal argument to a much cruder joke, consistent with the kind of humor the show had used throughout its entire history. Notably, Charlie Kirk himself was aware of the episode and had already publicly reacted to it before the tragic events that would later change everything about how the episode was understood. On August 7th, 2025, the day after the episode originally aired, Kirk posted a message on the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter, responding directly to Cartman's portrayal of him in the episode. His comment, phrased casually and appearing genuinely amused, praised the character specifically, essentially telling Cartman that the impression was well done. This public reaction meant that Kirk himself had already seen the episode, recognized the parody clearly aimed at his own public persona, and responded to it good-naturedly rather than with any sign of anger or offense, treating the mockery the same way many other public figures had learned to treat their own South Park portrayals over the years, as an unavoidable but generally harmless part of achieving a certain level of fame. Everything about the episode's reception changed completely just over a month later. On September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk was shot and killed while speaking at an event held at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah, as part of a tour his organization had been running called the American Comeback Tour. According to reporting on the shooting, Kirk was answering audience questions about topics including mass shootings and gun violence at the exact moment he was struck by a single gunshot to the neck. He was 31 years old at the time of his death. Following the shooting, the FBI opened an investigation and treated the attack as a targeted assassination, with agents recovering a high-powered rifle believed to have been used in the killing as part of their ongoing search for the person responsible. The shooting immediately became one of the biggest news stories in the country, generating widespread shock and grief across a wide range of political perspectives, along with significant public attention focused on the manhunt for whoever had carried out the attack. Within this atmosphere of raw, immediate national tension, attention quickly turned toward any piece of media that had recently portrayed Kirk in any way, including the South Park episode that had mocked him just weeks earlier using Cartman's exaggerated version of his public persona. Comedy Central made its decision quickly, acting the very night of the shooting itself. According to reporting from multiple entertainment news outlets, the network had scheduled a rerun of Got a Nut to air as part of its regular rotation of previous South Park episodes that same evening, following the show's usual pattern during breaks between new episodes of airing older installments from the current season in order. Once news of Kirk's shooting broke, Comedy Central quietly pulled the scheduled rerun from its broadcast lineup, replacing it with a different episode instead. Sources close to the network described this decision as intended to be temporary, made specifically out of respect for the sudden and shocking circumstances surrounding Kirk's death, rather than representing any kind of permanent ban connected to the episode's content. It is important to be precise about exactly what this decision did and did not involve, since some public conversation following the news mischaracterized the situation to varying degrees. The episode was not removed from Paramount Plus, the streaming platform that continued to host Got a Nut without any changes or restrictions following the shooting. Anyone with access to Paramount Plus could still watch the complete, unedited episode at any point after Kirk's death, including the exact same jokes and references that had existed in the episode since its original broadcast a month earlier. The only actual change involved Comedy Central specifically choosing not to include the episode in its scheduled cable rerun rotation during the immediate days following the shooting, a decision affecting how the episode would appear on traditional cable television broadcasts rather than affecting the episode's overall availability to the public. The situation surrounding this decision grew more complicated because of how some of Kirk's supporters chose to interpret the connection between the episode and his death. In the hours and days following the shooting, some supporters connected to Kirk's political movement comment suggested, without any confirmed evidence supporting the claim, that South Park's mockery of Kirk may have somehow contributed to or encouraged the atmosphere that led to his assassination. This theory circulated across social media and some conservative commentary, though no official investigation into the shooting ever connected the attack to the South Park episode in any confirmed or substantiated way. The suspicion itself, regardless of its lack of verified support, added significant pressure to the already tense situation Comedy Central found itself navigating in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. This particular controversy created a genuinely unusual situation compared to every other instance of South Park facing backlash covered throughout this story so far. In every previous case, the show had faced consequences directly connected to content that people found offensive, threatening, or embarrassing, while that content remained entirely fictional and safely separated from any real-world tragedy. The situation surrounding Gotta Nut was different because a real, violent, unexpected death had occurred involving the exact same real person the episode had mocked, transforming what had been a fairly typical piece of political satire, similar in tone to countless other South Park jokes aimed at public figures over the decades, into something suddenly carrying an entirely different emotional weight it never possessed at the time it was written or originally broadcast. Comparing this situation to the earlier controversy surrounding episodes 200 and 201 helps clarify exactly what made this moment distinct. During the crisis surrounding those episodes back in 2010, the danger had been aimed directly at the show's own creators, tied to a threat of violence that fortunately never materialized into any actual harm. With Gotta Nut, the situation reversed entirely. Nobody connected to making South Park faced any threat to their own safety at any point during this controversy. Instead, the person the show had mocked became the actual victim of real-world violence, completely unconnected to anything the show had done, creating a strange and uncomfortable coincidence between a piece of satire and a tragedy that happened to follow it by only a matter of weeks. The pulling of the scheduled rerun also stands apart from earlier examples of censorship covered throughout this story because of how limited and specific the action actually was compared to the network's own history of handling controversial content. Comedy Central's decision regarding episode 201 back in 2010 had involved permanently altering audio, bleeping out entire sections of dialogue, and eventually removing both related episodes from circulation for years afterward, a response driven by genuine concern over physical safety and credible fear of violence. The situation surrounding Gotta Nut involved nothing resembling that level of alteration or permanent restriction. The episode itself remained completely unedited and fully accessible through streaming. The only action taken was a temporary scheduling change affecting cable reruns, driven by a sense of respect and caution regarding the sudden, tragic circumstances rather than any credible threat connected to the episode's continued broadcast. Reaction to Comedy Central's decision split along familiar lines once news of the pulled rerun became public. Some viewers and commentators viewed the network's response as a reasonable, sensitive gesture, given the shocking and sudden nature of Kirk's death, arguing that continuing to air a comedic portrayal of someone so soon after their violent killing would have understandably struck many viewers as tasteless or disrespectful, regardless of the episode's original intent or Kirk's own earlier positive reaction to it. Others criticized the decision as an unnecessary overreaction, pointing out that the episode remained fully available on streaming anyway, making the cable pullback feel more like a symbolic gesture than any meaningful form of restriction, while also raising broader questions about whether political satire should ever face this kind of pressure simply because a mocked public figure later became the victim of an unrelated violent crime. Kirk's own family and supporters continued speaking publicly about his life and legacy in the days following his death, with much of that conversation understandably focused on tributes and remembrance rather than television scheduling decisions. Separate from any direct discussion of the South Park episode itself, broader political reaction to the shooting included public statements from various figures across the political spectrum condemning the violence, including a statement from President Trump specifically blaming what he described as radical left political violence for the attack, adding another layer of political tension to an already highly charged national moment. South Park itself, through its creators, did not release any additional public statements specifically addressing the decision to pull the rerun or responding directly to Kirk's death in connection with the episode. This silence stood in contrast to earlier moments in the show's history, such as the direct public statement Parker and Stone had released following the heavy censorship applied to episode 201 back in 2010. In that earlier situation, the creators had felt compelled to publicly clarify their own position position and defend the integrity of their work. Following the events surrounding Gotta Nut, no equivalent public statement emerged from Parker or Stone specifically addressing the rerun situation, leaving Comedy Central's brief, quiet scheduling decision to speak for itself without any additional creative input or commentary from the people who had actually written and produced the episode months earlier. The show returned to its regular new episode schedule not long after this controversy, continuing to air new installments of its 27th season on Comedy Central and Paramount Plus without any further disruption connected to the Kirk situation. Gotta Nut itself has remained available on Paramount Plus consistently since its original release, meaning that despite the intense attention surrounding its brief removal from cable reruns, the episode never actually became difficult to find or watch for anyone interested in seeing it, a detail that separates this particular controversy sharply from earlier, far more permanent restrictions applied to episodes like 200, 201, and Super Best Friends. Taken as a whole, the story surrounding Gotta Nut represents something genuinely unique within South Park's long history of controversy. It did not involve the show provoking anger through its own content in the traditional sense, since the episode itself had originally aired to a largely positive or at least unremarkable reception, including a friendly, amused reaction from Kirk himself before his death. Instead, the controversy emerged entirely from outside circumstances arriving after the fact, transforming an already broadcast piece of satire into something carrying unexpected weight purely because of a violent tragedy that had nothing directly to do with the show, its creators, or anything contained within the episode's actual content. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This closes out a long chain of very different trouble, from a quiet network edit over a house fire, through international bans and death threats, to an unplanned collision with real tragedy nobody could have predicted. Looking back across every instance in this story, one last piece remains: the moment the show turned its own history of almost getting canceled into a joke. Section 10. The show that marketed its own cancellation. After surviving nearly every kind of real trouble a television show can run into, from network censorship to international bans to actual threats of violence, South Park eventually did something nobody expected. Heading into its 22nd season in 2018, the show launched an entire advertising campaign built around asking the public to cancel it, taking every ounce of stress and controversy connected to its long history and turning it into a joke aimed directly at the audience. The campaign carried the name Cancel South Park, built around a hashtag designed to spread quickly across social media platforms. It began in September of 2018, ahead of the premiere of the show's 22nd season, and it was created and run by Comedy Central itself, rather than being any kind of accident or leak. This detail matters, since it means the network responsible for making real censorship decisions throughout the show's history was this time the same organization intentionally pretending the show was in danger, flipping its usual role completely. The first sign of the campaign appeared through a short video posted to South Park's official Twitter account. The video opened against a plain black background, showing text stating that America had reached a crossroads, followed by a question asking what the country would do next. The video then displayed the hashtag Cancel South Park, giving no further explanation and leaving viewers to interpret the message however they chose. Rather than clarifying anything, South Park's own official account began actively encouraging people to use the hashtag, responding cheerfully to fans who picked it up and played along, even while giving no indication of whether the show itself was actually facing any real threat. The timing of this campaign connected directly to a broader cultural moment happening across entertainment media that same year. Several television shows had recently faced real, serious cancellation following public backlash tied to specific controversies. The revival of the sitcom Roseanne had been canceled that same year after its star posted a racist message online. The political drama House of Cards had also gone through major changes following serious allegations made against one of its lead actors. These situations had made hashtag campaigns demanding a show be canceled a common and recognizable part of how entertainment controversies played out online by that point, usually driven by real public anger connected to something a person or show had actually done. South Park's decision to launch its own version of this exact kind of campaign, entirely on its own and without any actual controversy driving it, worked as a kind of preemptive joke, poking fun at the pattern before anyone had a real reason to apply it to the show specifically. Rather than waiting for genuine backlash and then responding to it the way the show had done during every previous controversy covered throughout throughout this story, Comedy Central chose to manufacture the appearance of backlash entirely on its own terms, using the language and structure of a real cancellation campaign as marketing rather than crisis response. The campaign extended well beyond a single social media post. According to reporting connected to the marketing effort, Comedy Central placed physical billboard advertisements in major cities across the country, including New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, all carrying the same "Cancel South Park" message without any additional context explaining what the phrase actually referred to. Fans who spotted these billboards in person often shared photos of them online, adding to the growing confusion and conversation surrounding the campaign as people tried to figure out whether something serious had actually happened connected to the show. Beyond outdoor advertising, the campaign also secured unusually high-profile placement across major television broadcasts completely unrelated to South Park itself. Promotional spots connected to the "Cancel South Park" message reportedly appeared during coverage of the Emmy Awards, during an episode of Saturday Night Live, and during Monday Night Football, placing the mysterious hashtag in front of massive television audiences who had no obvious connection to South Park's usual fan base. This wide reach helped generate exactly the kind of confusion and curiosity that turns into free media coverage, with numerous entertainment outlets writing articles specifically trying to explain what the campaign meant and whether South Park was actually in any danger. According to details connected to the campaign's own promotional materials afterward, describing the strategy used to build the effort, Comedy Central relied heavily on data collected from 21 previous seasons worth of information about how South Park's audience behaved, including where fans lived, what other shows and platforms they engaged with, and how they typically responded to marketing across different types of media. This information reportedly shaped decisions about exactly where to place billboards, which television placements to prioritize, and how to design the social media portion of the rollout to reach the show's existing fan base as efficiently as possible, treating the entire fake cancellation campaign as a carefully planned, data-driven marketing exercise rather than a simple, spontaneous joke. The social media portion of the campaign generated a substantial amount of engagement, according to figures shared afterward connected to the campaign's own reporting. The various promotional posts and custom social media content connected to the effort reportedly earned over 130 million impressions, along with more than 34 million video views spread across different platforms. These numbers reflected just how effectively the confusing, unexplained nature of the campaign managed to spread across the internet, driven largely by people trying to figure out what was actually happening rather than any clear, straightforward advertisement explaining the show's return date from the very beginning. Public reaction to the campaign mixed genuine confusion with a fair amount of humor once people started putting the pieces together. Some fans played along enthusiastically, posting their own messages using the hashtag, joking that the show's own creators seemed to be quietly admitting they were tired and ready to be done with the series after so many years. The official South Park account responded to some of these posts directly, thanking fans for their support of the cancellation while immediately following up with information about when the new season would actually premiere, maintaining the joke consistently rather than breaking character to explain the situation early. Other observers focused specifically on trying to figure out the actual purpose behind the strange campaign, noting that unlike most show premieres, which typically build hype using preview clips, cast interviews, or hints about upcoming storylines, South Park had instead chosen to build anticipation using a message suggesting the exact opposite of everything a normal promotional campaign usually tries to accomplish. Some coverage at the time speculated that this unusual approach might have been connected to production timing, suggesting the show may not have had finished footage ready to share yet for the new season, making a mystery-based campaign a practical alternative to traditional preview content rather than purely an artistic choice. The confusion generated by the campaign eventually resolved itself the same way it always does with these kinds of marketing stunts, once the actual premiere date arrived and the new season of South Park simply began airing as normal. Rather than facing any real cancellation, the show returned on schedule, continuing its run without any disruption connected to the campaign whatsoever. Looking back at coverage published shortly afterward, some outlets specifically noted the irony of the entire situation, pointing out that Colorado's own long-running animated series about itself was not actually going anywhere despite an advertising campaign built entirely around suggesting otherwise. The full, lasting irony of the Cancel South Park campaign became even clearer as time went on, extending well beyond the show's 22nd season premiere in 2018. Rather than facing any kind of ending, South Park continued running for years afterward, eventually receiving a major renewal announcement confirming new seasons that would carry the show through 2022 at the time, and the show has continued renewing and expanding its run in the years since, including the massive new deal secured with Paramount account that led directly into the politically charged season covered earlier in this story. What began as a fake cancellation campaign turned out to accurately predict nothing at all about the show's future, standing today as one of the more openly self-aware and playful moments in South Park's entire history, a rare instance where the show controlled every part of its own controversy from beginning to end, rather than reacting to pressure created by someone else entirely. This campaign also reveals something important when placed alongside every other story covered throughout this account of South Park's long history with cancellation, censorship, and controversy. Every other situation described throughout this story involved real outside forces, whether that meant a cautious network executive, an extremist group issuing genuine threats, a foreign government exercising total control over its own internet, or a sitting president's official spokesperson responding to a pointed piece of political satire. The Cancel South Park campaign stands apart from all of it specifically because no outside force was involved at any point. Comedy Central, the same organization responsible for cutting the fire scene back in 1997 and bleeping an entire closing speech back in 2010, chose this time to manufacture an entirely fake version of the exact same kind of crisis, fully aware the whole time that nothing about the situation was actually real. There is something fitting about a show built almost entirely around mocking hypocrisy, censorship, and the strange, exaggerated way society reacts to controversy, eventually turning that exact same pattern back onto itself as a marketing tool. Trey Parker and Matt Stone spent decades responding to genuine attempts to silence or restrict their work, defending their episodes publicly, absorbing real financial and personal risk, and watching entire countries erase their show from public view. By 2018, the two of them, working together with their own network, had clearly spent enough time inside that pattern to understand exactly how to recreate its shape on command, using the language and structure of real controversy purely for entertainment, without any actual danger attached to it at all. Looking back across the entire history covered throughout this story, from a quiet, cautious edit made to protect against copycat behavior connected to a house fire in 1997, through years of religious controversy, a personal loss connected to a beloved cast member, direct threats of violence from an extremist group, a total government ban covering an entire country, a public clash with the sitting president of the United States, and finally an unplanned, tragic connection to a real-world assassination, South Park has faced nearly every possible version of the exact kind of trouble a television show can encounter. The Cancel South Park campaign sits at the end of this chain as something different from everything before it. Not a genuine crisis the show had to survive, but a moment where the show itself, fully in control, decided to play with the entire idea of its own ending. Fully aware that after everything it had already survived, nothing about a fake hashtag was ever going to be the thing that finally took it off the air. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.